Please welcome Louis Akenji, Managing Director, Hot or Cool. Kelly Levin, Chief of Science, Data and Systems Change, Bezos Earth Fund. And Moderator Heather Clancy, Vice President and Editorial Director, GreenBiz.
Good morning, everyone. A big shout out to the team backstage. You have no idea what's going on back there, but it's pretty awesome and amazing. Thank you also to the team here at Solve for inviting me to do this. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for all the good work you're doing. We have some great people here on this panel. I'm not going to read their bios because their experience is going to come out in their work, in what we're going to discuss. But I can tell you that they're both very focused on changing the systems, right? What we need to do to solve these problems. I'm going to start with Louis. And by the way, I couldn't get them to stop talking backstage, so I told them to make me just irrelevant here. But Louis, hot or cool? My answer was cool backstage, but your organization does some really interesting work. I had to look up what your focus was, but I was really struck by this on your website. You're focusing on how everyone can be in a fair consumption space, right? The principles that your organization espouse: well-being and prosperity, fairness and justice, and living within ecological limits. Now, we know that the U.S. has a footprint that's way too high. We know that other places have been really systemically shut out of some of these things, but they're bearing the brunt of the impact. So I'm curious, how do we begin to really think about the radical changes we need? And I would love to hear about some of the specific places that you visited that may be models of what we can achieve.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me here. We at the Hot or Cool Institute, I don't know whether you are hot or cool, but I'll let you decide. What we've done at the Institute is to bring science and numbers to some of these very fluffy spaces. Everyone has a lifestyle, so when you say sustainable lifestyle, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but what does the science say? If you take this from a climate perspective, when we started talking about climate change, we saw it as primarily a technical issue to bring down emissions. But very slowly, we're beginning to see that the environmental is the social, right? There's inequality, there's poverty, there's social tensions that are rising, and people sort of acting on these tensions are beginning to delegitimize very meaningful solutions. So we are not going to address climate change without addressing the social tensions that are embedded within this. That's the first thing. The second thing is there are very clear areas where action is needed, especially if you look at it from a well-being or quality of life perspective. This is food, mobility, and housing. If you can address these three, you've already addressed about 75% of the emissions that are coming from our ways of living, whether it's in the United States or outside. But quite important to understand that when you talk about sustainable lifestyles or behavior change, it's not what I typically call consumer scapegoatism, just putting all the responsibility on individuals. It's quite important to articulate the difference between individual agency, what individuals can do, and what the system or businesses and governments need to do. This is why we insist on looking at things from a provisioning perspective rather than just an individualized perspective. It's quite important because choices are articulated within a context, a socio-technical context. And if you cannot change that context, you won't get people changing. So you have places like in the UK, Repowering, which is helping communities to invest in community-owned energy investment systems where everyone benefits and a lower per capita impact. You also have things in other countries like cooperative housing that is beginning to grow. The whole idea is that everyone gets provision, but the overall impact per capita reduces. So there's lots of very good examples that don't put the burden just on the individual, that help in reducing some of the social tensions, and that bring us within ecological limits.
Yeah. And Kelly, I imagine many people in the room have heard of the Bezos Earth Fund, $10 billion to apply towards climate mitigation and adaptation. I think I saw that about 1.63 has been granted already. What can you share about some of the early recipients and really how much of it has ended up in vulnerable communities, right, that really need this first or most?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And thanks to the organizers for having me here today. if you think about frontline communities, not only are they often the most impacted by climate change, but often also have some of the greatest solutions and can be agents of change, because at the end of the day, as Lewis was saying, these are global problems, but they translate to a local level to people. And how climate impacts people and how they play a role in solutions is going to be critical if we're going to address this. For us, we have spent about $300 million on local communities, disadvantaged communities right now, which is around 18% of the funding that we have put forward. And a lot of that, for example, we made a $200 million commitment towards Justice 40, which is a plan to have 40% of the federal investments in the United States to go towards climate solutions in disadvantaged communities and climate impacts. And we are using our funding to be able to allow those communities to access that funding, because without the tools to be able to access it, it could be spent quite badly. Another thing that we've been doing is significant work around indigenous communities. We have a large pillar of work around conservation 30 by 30. Many of you might have heard about protecting 30% of land and sea by 2030. And indigenous communities, while a small percentage of the population, are on about 85% of that land that is looked at to being conserved. So we put together a coalition of donors to convene $1.65 billion towards indigenous communities' role in conservation movements. So that's just two examples.
Yeah. Lewis, how would you like to see the Earth Fund spend their money?
I'd like to ask for the $1.65 billion. We could help.
Aim higher.
We could help.
Right. But also, are those the right places? Where else?
I think it's fantastic. One of the things I like about what you're doing is you're taking a systemic approach. You're not burden shifting, which I think is extremely important. There are also a few places where to get inspiration. The UN Sustainable Development Goals have brought out this wonderful framework. It's not perfect, but it's fairly ambitious, which can guide us. But there's other places like the Club of Rome under the Earth for All project has come up with 5 key areas where we need radical transformation. These are agriculture, energy, poverty reduction, inequality, and empowerment, especially empowerment of women. I think these are guiding questions. But what is really important now, if you take a political economy perspective of this issue, is that we invest in provisioning systems that improve quality of life and diminish dependence on on vulnerable spaces, right? But it also means that we invest in areas, not only in technical issues, but we start investing in people, in well-being programs. I dare say one of the things that is missing right now, especially since you mentioned numbers in the billions, is we talk about sustainability a lot without articulating what it really means. What would a sustainable tomorrow look like? What role would businesses play? How would people see each other? What would governance look like? Beginning to help an articulation of this vision within ecological limits would be especially useful, including when it comes to ensuring that the well-being of people is a good part of this. Otherwise, we will get an environmentally sustainable society which is psychologically broken.
Yeah. One of the challenges with systems change is you have a lot of established organizations, right, that have been in the system for a long time, many of which are trying to actually help change a system, but, and your former employer actually has done a lot of great work, WRI, in terms of addressing early sustainability problems. How do we get them to change their approach, or is that the right approach? Is it more working with local organizations versus these big international, things that maybe can't get work done as quickly on the ground as they should?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, we've kind of chewed through the carbon budget so quickly that there's no silver bullet left. And we do need it all. I think if you think about the drivers of systemic change, as Lewis was mentioning, it's so multidimensional. There's the role of government. And then it's a question of those who can work on policy and regulation to be able to influence government. and to change the hearts and minds of politicians and voters, right? Then there's the role of business, and those that both changing the businesses themselves and changing those that hold value in the business and can lobby the business, and the policymakers who are going to shape the environment in which the business operates. Then there's citizens, and those both in the individual leaders and then the collective, the mass movements. And then there's also, we off stage had a wonderful conversation with an artist. There are the artists and the poets and those that are going to change the hearts and minds, and the media, who everyone is, getting shaped their minds by the stories that we read. And we need it all. And that's going to take big organizations that are, well entrenched in the establishment and can reach out to the elites, and it's going to take those that are working at the local level and can implement something. If I think about something that we invest in on African restoration, where AFR 100, where we're restoring 100,000 hectares of land, and there you need to reach to small business owners and small communities, which often can't get financed by private sector, for example. And then philanthropy can help move those funds to be able to reach the local level in a way that is not happening right now. So I think that everyone can play a role in different ways, and unfortunately we need that at this point because there's no silver bullet. It's a bunch of puzzle pieces coming together to affect systemic change.
Okay. Well, I am going to ask both of you to imagine the future a little bit. Kelly, I'm going to go to you first. It's 2030. Your organization has given out that last billion. What changes can we see in the system for how climate action is catalyzed and financed? So, how can we create a system of finance that's not just this grant money, this big pool, but is an ongoing system that helps finance the change we need?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the question here is how do we leverage our efforts to make other things happen? And can we reach tipping points so that the private sector runs with something? And in some places, we're closer to tipping points than other places. I think for us, if you think about the change that we need this decade in the climate space, it's declining emissions, on the order of, 43%. And that translates into a number of shifts, from phasing out the internal combustion engine to electrifying industry to shifting our diets. We were talking about fashion and consumption. And within each one of those, there are a number of different actions that we need to do this decade. For us, we've started to identify some areas that we're going to put significant efforts around. When I'm thinking about our nature portfolio, for example, it's conserving what we haven't lost, it's restoring what we have lost, and it's sustainable food systems, which are the largest driver of land conversion, for example. And what we hope is that we're catalyzing efforts of other investors to come in to be able to make meaningful change that actually tips us over towards kind of irresistible and unstoppable momentum. And it's a large challenge, it's daunting, but that's what we're hoping each investment would kind of cascade.
Okay. So I'm going to go to Bangkok with you, Louis. What does it look like in 2030? What's happening on the ground? What will have changed?
I like Bangkok, especially the street food. So I hope that doesn't change. And I'm hoping by 2030 we've done such a good work at the Hot or Cool Institute that we're not needed anymore and we've become sustainable. But I think when we imagine the future, we usually imagine some kind of a slow transition. Things are going to get into a cascade. It took 13 years for horses to disappear from the streets of New York and be replaced by cars. That's how things cascade and get into place. Bangkok 2030, I think Bangkok would have stopped pretending that it wants to be like New York because it realizes that it cannot be New York, and that it doesn't mean it's a worse off city. It just means it has its own character and its own aspirations that are different. It's welcomed its beautiful chaos and urban indigenous communities and so on. But something you would probably also notice in 2030 is that we've demystified the view that we can simply replace the internal combustion engine with the electronic vehicles. That is not going to happen. We don't have enough resources to get a one-to-one replacement of traditional cars as we know them now. So you wouldn't be able to hail a cab just the way you typically do right now, or to get your own fancy car and drive around. That would have changed. But what would have replaced this is mobility systems that are highly more efficient and intelligent, and that have a combination of better public infrastructure and micro-mobility. But something also interesting is also going to happen, I think. We talk about the price of energy right now, and we're almost wedded to fossil fuels. But once this architecture starts dissolving, it's going to dissolve really fast. We're seeing the prices of energy changing. So a lot of the powering you will see in Bangkok then is not going to be fossil fuel based, but a lot of electrification. So if any of you is thinking of investing after this, don't invest in fossil fuels.
I would hope they aren't.
Just saying.
Okay. So a few rapid fire questions with the remaining time we have left. I'm going to just go back and forth. What's the most frustrating thing about your work, Kelly?
I think one of the greatest challenges is that $10 billion is a huge amount of money. And for philanthropy, it's a huge amount of money. But in terms of what we need to solve the climate and nature crises, it's a drop in the bucket. And I think the biggest challenge is both recognizing with humility the tremendous opportunity we have, but also realizing that we need to be so strategic in making sure that this is spent in a way that catalyzes other finance. And it would be such a missed opportunity not to. And I think, one of the greatest challenges is how to do that, right? How do you bring others on board and make sure that that $10 billion is not just $10 billion, but is so much more.
Lewis.
Can I repeat that? I can help you with the $10 billion. I'm going to give an anecdote here. I had an interview with a well-known international media person, and the first question they asked me was, is this even possible? And I'm thinking, is this the 90s? We've moved so much in our understanding, in the science, in the possibilities, in solutions, that instead of recognizing this and capitalizing them, we have mainstream media still holding us back with a narrative that is, it seems to suggest that we need to go back into caves, or that this is not possible, or that things are not happening. I think we need the mainstream media to help us move this agenda forward and stop holding us back in the 90s, where it was a question of awareness raising. That frustrates me.
I will absolutely 100% agree with you on that one. Thank you for saying that. Most important lessons. Let's go there next. Kelly, most important lesson you've learned?
That's a tough one. I guess I'm learning every day, which is a real luxury. I guess reflecting on the last few years, so I moved over to the Bezos Earth Fund around a year and a half ago, and we're fairly new. I guess at that time, which is less so about my position, but just kind of the world, I think COVID taught me how quickly things can change. And there's a lot that you can take away from that, which is going back to your frustrating question about just the inability to move things. But at the same time, I guess the question is, how could we harness that rapid movement for the climate agenda? And I don't think any of us have kind of cracked that, but it was just eye-opening. I think at least in my lifetime, I've never seen the world change so quickly. And I guess if there's any silver lining, I guess it gave me a little bit of hope that we could figure this out.
Okay. Lewis.
I like your point, hope. I'm going to hang on to that one. I used to think, we're fighting with people against a better future, that we're fighting against people. But one thing I've learned is that almost everyone involved in this is trying to negotiate for a better tomorrow. We just have different views of it and how to get there. And once I got to the understanding of that, I thought it's just a question of all together developing an architecture for it and working along.
Okay. I have one more question. We have seconds left, but what makes you optimistic?
I guess what makes me optimistic is that we are starting to see nonlinear change in places. I mean, if you look at EVs or renewables, the analysts keep on redrawing their forecast because they never could have predicted it. And if we could replicate that, and it didn't happen on its own, it needs to be nurtured, but we need to replicate that across every single system.
I think there's a groundswell of goodwill and optimism, and we need to harness that. And I should add, I have a 6-year-old daughter. She's cute, so I want to make a better place for her.
Aw, well, thank you so much to both of you for sharing some of your wisdom. Please look up their bios and their organizations. They're doing awesome work, so thank you so much. Give them a hand.
Thank you.
Thank you.